What does human consciousness, large language models, quantum mechanics, chaos theory, Sabine Hassenfelder, and my dissertation have to do with each other? Well, let's take a look. Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. A few days ago, I watched Sabine Hassenfelder's excellent video on criticality, or the edge of chaos and human consciousness, and its relationship to quantum mechanics, and it made me think about large language models and how they also probably operate in this regime as well, and how my dissertation 30 years ago, almost to the day, it was actually March when I graduated, got into the weeds about the very new, or should we say emergent, discipline of chaos theory in physics as it applied to human thought and literature. So yeah, I've been thinking about this stuff for a long time. And more recently, I've been working on a research paper in this same area as well. So I've been thinking about a lot of this stuff, but I want to use Sabine's video, some little clips from it, as inspiration for my discussion. I, of course, will leave a link to the original video in the description so you can check out the whole thing. I highly recommend that. But here I'm going to grab a few clips. We're going to start with how a slow brain operates quickly. In other words, if somebody hits a baseball at you, if you've ever played baseball or softball or something like that, somebody will hit a baseball from home plate, and let's say you're playing shortstop or second base or whatever, that ball gets to you really, really quickly, and you have to scoop it up and then, of course, throw it to first base. That all has to happen very, very rapidly, and our brains are very slow.
Yet the neurons that power this process are super slow. It takes 10 to 20 milliseconds for a signal to travel from one neuron to another. Today's computers, for comparison, perform hundreds of billions, if not trillions, of operations per second. So how does the brain do it? The new study reveals that the brain's secret lies in its ability to teeter on the edge of chaos. And not only this, they say that the mathematics of quantum physics is a surprisingly good description for consciousness. The edge of chaos is the range in which a system switches from orderly behavior to a chaotic one. This transition regime is somewhat less poetically called the critical range, and it's where interesting things happen. The critical range is where emergent features develop and where complexity arises.
So there's a lot to unpack here. First of all, chaos theory, or it's now termed dynamic systems theory. Chaos theory was the more poetic term. I actually still prefer it, but of course that was earlier. But anyway, the very famous Mandelbrot set would be something that you might know about from chaos theory, from that sort of realm of physics and mathematics. And when you visualize the Mandelbrot set, what you're actually looking at is the dividing line between inside the set, which is the black part inside the, kind of blob or whatever that shape is. I don't know exactly what the shape is, but anyway, it's what, 2.5 dimensions, something like that. But anyway, inside the set, and then there's outside the set. But then on the border is where the interesting stuff happens. That's the critical range. That's the area where you don't know if the number, if Z, if you iterate on Z, if it's going to stay within the set or if it's going to, go outside the set and blow up to infinity. And all of those beautiful colors and swirls and everything are just related to how many iterations it has to go before it blows up to infinity. So that's how the coloration of that set actually happens. Many other sets like Julia sets and things like that as well, and many other chaotic effects. In fact, we've discovered that much of reality, including apparently the brain, sits on this critical range between being inside the set, in other words, being orderly, and being outside the set, in other words, being completely chaotic. And my research into large language models has also looked at this effect, and from that I'd argue that large language models also sit on this border between orderliness. Orderliness is boring ultimately, right? You get no new information, everything is pre-known, all of that kind of stuff. Complete chaos is also useful. That's like noise. What you want is that really interesting transition period right between the orderliness, the boringness of regular stuff, and chaos. That's where creativity happens. And that's, of course, why I applied this to Samuel Beckett in my dissertation. If you're interested, you can actually still find it. It's out of print, but I will leave a link to it in the description. You can get out of print copies of my dissertation if you are so interested. But anyway, all of the interesting stuff happens right on that border. And the fascinating part is the paper that Sabine discusses actually shows that Schrodinger's equation, the equation of quantum mechanics, the state equation, describes this critical range. And that is a really interesting revelation, that we're starting to fold in aspects of quantum mechanics with aspects of chaos theory. And the important point of this paper gets into long-range correlations. So let's take a listen to that.
We seek a balance between order and chaos. This is what criticality means. And here is the important bit. A critical system has long-range correlations. like those links between nations. To be honest, what I just said is pure conjecture. We don't have the mathematics to describe how complexity actually arises. But this criticality is an idea borrowed from physics, where we do have a rigorous definition of relations. Like educational relations, we get complexity. This is the world that we live in. We seek a balance between order and chaos. This is what criticality means. And here is the important bit: a critical system has long-range correlations, like those links between nations. To be honest, what I just said is pure conjecture. We don't have the mathematics to describe how complexity actually arises. But this criticality is an idea borrowed from physics, where we do have a rigorous definition for it. One of the most amazing examples is a Bose-Einstein condensation, in which the long-range correlations create a quantum state for the entire condensate.
So let's break down the important point here. The critical range between orderliness and chaos is this criticality state, as we said. But what that allows is for long-range correlations to happen. A Bose-Einstein condensate, I don't know if it's Bose. She said Bose. I was like, I've always heard it as Bose-Einstein. But anyway, this condensate, what it is a macroscopic quantum state. The atoms in the Bose-Einstein condensate are all correlated to each other. They're all entangled, and it creates really, really bizarre stuff. And the theory with this paper, the hypothesis is that this is what's happening in your brain. And my further hypothesis is that this is also happening, or some analog to this is happening in large language models when they are doing next token prediction. In other words, what the next word is that's coming out. These very, very complex models are showing emergent behavior that is correlating features across long ranges, just like a Bose-Einstein condensate. And so finally, here's a clip where she discusses the details of the paper.
To come back to the brain, it's also a complex system. So if the idea of the edge of chaos is correct, then the human brain must also linger in the critical range between order and chaos. It can probably switch from the one to the other and use the long-range correlations that come with the transition. In the new paper now, the authors say that this criticality is why the human brain can make surprisingly fast and accurate decisions, even though the individual computational operations are so slow. The long-range connections of critical systems let different parts of the brain talk to each other. It's not just fast, but part of the reason why the human brain can function with so little power. Your average supercomputer needs at least megawatts of power, whereas the human brain runs on typically 20 watts. That's about what it takes to power a dim bulb. Wilder still, they say they use the mathematics of quantum mechanics to develop a model for what's going on in the human brain, and that allowed them to quantify how critical the state of a brain is. They then used functional MRI brain scans from over 1,000 people and found that using this measure for criticality, they could tell apart people who were awake from those who were sleeping. It seems that criticality indeed tells us something about consciousness.
All right, so super intriguing, right? You can use the equations of quantum mechanics to model the criticality of the human brain, and then you can use that as a falsifiable test to determine, this is pretty basic, awake or asleep, that's not that big a deal. You could just probably look at the fMRI. But the fascinating part is that you can use this equation that shouldn't have anything to do with consciousness to actually make predictions about this, and maybe over time they can refine these calculations and things and get more detailed information about what the brain is doing based on its criticality. So now how do I make a leap from this, from the human brain, which is, squishy carbon-based, to large language models that operate very, very differently on a silicon substrate as opposed to a carbon substrate? How do we make that leap? Well, nobody's actually done the research paper at this point, but what happens with a large language model is that you train it, right? You give it billions of, maybe trillions of parameters. It takes in all of this information from the world in the form of text tokens, at least the traditional versions. We can leave aside video and audio and other things like that, but we can just take traditional large language models that only deal with text tokens. The model ingests all of this stuff and trains itself and tunes all of these billions of weights. And then when you run it back in inference mode, you say like, hey, tell me a story about why the sky is blue or something like that. It uses that request as a prompt. It's like, that's the beginning. And then it starts to fill in the next token. So it says the sky is blue, right? It's predicting next token, next token, next token, next token. That doesn't seem that interesting until you look at what goes on under the hood in these large language models. And what they're doing is making long range correlations between things. It has to have a pretty solid understanding of at least language, if not the world itself. And there's been arguments about, is this AGI? Can it be AGI without being embodied, without having more information about the world? If you haven't checked out my most recent video, I'll put it up here and at the end of this video about how a large language model, O3 in particular, is able to give me beta or information about rock climbing routes in my gym. It's really fascinating. It's able to sort of bridge that gap between being a disembodied AI agent and having a quasi body. In other words, being able to understand the physicality of the world and the physicality of human movement through the world. Really, really interesting stuff. And my contention here is that that emergent behavior, and that's one of the terms of chaos theory, emergence, right? You have tiny, tiny, tiny little changes, like the butterfly effect. That's a famous one again. Butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil and you get a tornado in Texas, that kind of a thing, right? You have these tiny little changes that are microscopic, basically. They're undetectable almost, and they emerge. They go up through the scale layers almost unchanged and create this massive emergent behavior. And my argument here is that that's what large language models are doing. They're creating this emergent behavior. You're seeing tiny little variations based on either the random noise of selecting a different word that's not the highest probability word, or the exact nature of the prompt. If you change one letter or one word in the prompt, everything gets altered and you get a different response. And that response could either be very, very similar or fundamentally different depending on the kind of attractor state of where the large language model is. And so you're seeing emergence of behavior in these large language models that are based on long-range correlations. In other words, a word that was said way back here has an effect on something way over here. Just like the way your brain, apparently according to this paper, is making correlations, is making connections between things at very, very high speeds because it's resting in the critical range between order and chaos. And while I haven't finished my paper yet, my argument is that large language models are sitting on this critical range as well. They're teetering between order and chaos, and that sitting on the apex of criticality between order and chaos allows these large language models to also make long-range correlations and understand much more about the world than we would give them credit for what they are. They're just multiplying numbers in a large spreadsheet. And that shouldn't really create anything interesting. It shouldn't create emergent behavior or anything. If you run your financial calculations through a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet over and over again, you're just going to get the same answer over and over again. It's going to be very, very boring. But because these large language models are sitting right on that apex between order and chaos, they produce really interesting effects. And those effects, if this correlation with brains is true, should be able to be modeled by quantum mechanical equations, and we should be able to basically read the criticality of the large language model at any given state and predict whether it's going to give us interesting or uninteresting outcomes. So I hope you find this as fascinating as I do. This is really, really cool stuff that we can look at brains and physics and quantum mechanics and large language models and systems descending into chaos. We can look at all of these things and tie them together. I will end this with a request. My mathematical chops in the realm of quantum mechanics are sorely out of date. It's been a long time. Like I said, it's been 30 years since my dissertation and even longer since I did heavy-duty calculations in quantum mechanics. So if a physicist out there is interested in working with me on trying to model large language models with equations similar to what we saw in this paper, I would definitely like to hear from you. Hit me up here on YouTube or over on X. My information, of course, is in the description, so you can go check that out. If you are interested, we might be able to produce a really cool paper together. And for everybody else, let me know in the comments what you think about all of this while you're down there. If you don't mind liking the video, it really helps other people find it. And if you want to see more of this type of video and my other ramblings about AI and technology, etc., please consider subscribing to the channel, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.